Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The music pounded like a second heartbeat inside the club, dim lights pulsing in tune with the throb of bass. Cindy leaned against the bar, a glass of something sweet and burning in her hand, her body swaying gently to the rhythm. She wore a short wine-red dress that shimmered under the lights, her makeup flawless, her smile practiced to perfection. Around her, laughter rang out, bodies moved in a blur, and phones captured every second of the night like trophies for social media. Cindy was in her element. She always had a drink in hand, a compliment thrown her way, and a man ready to spend money just to keep her smiling. It wasn't that she loved any of them. None of the men she spent time with had names that lingered in her mind past sunrise. It was the thrill she craved, the feeling of being untouchable, the freedom to move from one night to the next, without consequence, without pause. Her apartment was a cramped one-room space off a busy street in Surrey, but she rarely slept there alone. Most mornings, she woke up in places that didn't feel like hers, hotel rooms with white sheets that smelled of perfume and cologne, or furnished flats where her heels clacked on marble tiles while she hunted for her bag. Sometimes she left before dawn, sometimes she stayed for breakfast, always making sure to leave with something in hand, money, a gift, or even just the lingering scent of someone's cologne as proof that she still had the power. Her phone buzzed constantly, a stream of chats from men with nicknames like Mr. Benz, Port Harcourt Plug, or Lecky Daddy. None of them knew her real story, and truthfully, neither did she. Somewhere between pretending and performing, Cindy had forgotten what she truly wanted. She told herself she was living her best life, that she was too young to be tied down. But some nights, when the club had closed and her lashes were off, she sat by her window and wondered if there was more. Just a little more than this. But before the question could take root, the day would break again, and another distraction would arrive. A new invite, a weekend getaway. Another man who said all the right things with a wallet to match. She was surrounded by friends who lived the same way, girls who changed phones every 6 months, who dated men twice their age, who laughed about scandals like they were gossip headlines. Cindy fit in perfectly, but deep inside, a quiet restlessness began to stir. Not guilt, not yet, just a dull ache, like an old bruise she didn't want to press. Still, she pushed it down. She wore it like perfume, hidden beneath layers of confidence and charm. Her life moved fast, too fast for reflection. And so, she danced. She laughed. She collected attention like currency, never knowing that somewhere in the future, every night she thought she had escaped would come back, louder, heavier, and impossible to silence. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where Lagos sun pressed down without mercy and the scent of grilled suyo wafted through the air like temptation. Cindy hadn't planned on attending the birthday party. It was for a friend of a friend, someone she barely knew, but she needed a distraction, and the venue promised free drinks, good music, and familiar faces. The compound in Lecky was spacious, filled with loud chatter and the occasional clink of bottles as waiters navigated through pockets of laughter. Cindy arrived fashionably late, clad in a fitted two-piece that hugged her in all the right places, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Her entrance was smooth, confident, the way it always was. People turned. Compliments followed. She smiled. But as she walked past the grill toward the shaded tent at the back, her eyes met someone she didn't recognize, a tall man sitting alone, nursing a drink and watching the chaos with an unreadable calm. His name, she'd later find out, was Zach. At that moment, though, there was nothing dramatic in their first exchange. No romantic spark, no bold flirting, just a quiet curiosity. He wasn't like the others. He didn't rise from his seat or flash her a grin. He simply nodded, then looked away as though he wasn't impressed or moved by her presence. It annoyed her at first. She wasn't used to being unnoticed. She found herself glancing back at him more than once as the party wore on. Something about his stillness unsettled her. Not coldness, just depth. When she finally approached him, it was out of boredom, or so she told herself. They spoke in slow sentences, awkward at first, then warm. Zach didn't ask her what she did for fun, or compliment her looks. He asked what books she liked, if she ever took time off social media, if she was happy in the way that mattered. His voice was low, deliberate, almost too honest. Cindy found herself stumbling over her words, laughing too loud. It wasn't charm she was chasing this time. It was something unfamiliar. That evening, she didn't exchange numbers with him. She walked away before the party ended, unsure of what had just happened. But she couldn't shake the way he'd made her feel, stripped, seen, as if he'd looked past her lashes and lipstick and into something she didn't show most people. 4 days afterward, she replayed the conversation, remembering the calm in his eyes, the way he hadn't tried to impress her. She told herself it was nothing, just a random meeting. But a week later, when a message came through from an unknown number saying, "Hey, you disappeared fast the other day. Can we continue that talk?" Cindy's heart did something strange. It slowed. It paused. And in that moment, something deep within her shifted. The messages became a quiet rhythm in Cindy's days. Never too many, never too eager, but always just enough to make her pause before replying. Zach didn't flood her phone with compliments or emojis. He sent her thoughts instead, sometimes about books he was reading, other times about traffic or the oddities he observed during his commutes. Their chats were simple, but they made her feel strangely anchored. It was different from the usual late-night, where-you-day texts she was used to. Zach didn't ask to see her at odd hours. He asked about her days, about her mother, about what made her laugh. The first time they met again after the party, it wasn't in a hotel lobby or a lounge. It was at a modest cafe tucked behind a printing press in Yaba. She arrived skeptical, already rehearsing excuses to leave early if things got boring. But they ended up talking for over 3 hours. No cameras, no posing, just talk. Real, meandering talk. When she left that day, she didn't feel flattered or flustered. She felt full and oddly safe. As weeks folded into each other, Cindy began peeling back parts of herself she hadn't visited in a long time. She didn't tell Zach everything, definitely not the parts she wanted forgotten, but she started filtering less. Around him, she didn't feel the need to be glossy. She began dressing differently when they met. Less showy, more comfortable. She stopped reaching for her phone mid-conversations, not because Zach minded, but because it no longer felt necessary. Her friends noticed the change. They teased her, saying she was growing soft, that Zach didn't look like someone who spent money without blinking, that maybe she was wasting her time. But Cindy had grown tired of loud things. Loud parties, loud friends, loud lies. Zach brought silence, but the good kind. The kind that let her hear herself think. Gradually, the invites from her old life lost their charm. The last time Mr. Benz called, she let it ring out. She didn't even save the number when he texted after. Something inside her was choosing, slowly, almost shyly, and it was choosing Zach. One Saturday evening, while seated beside Zach on the low steps in front of his flat, Cindy stared at the orange-pink sky and realized she hadn't felt this still in years. He was telling her about his childhood in Ibadan, the way his mother used to scold him in Proverbs, how he learned to tie his own shoelaces on the veranda with dust-covered feet. His stories weren't glamorous, but they were warm, honest, and they made her ache in places she thought had gone numb. She leaned her head on his shoulder without thinking, and he didn't flinch. He just stayed there, letting the silence carry them. That was the night Cindy knew, without the chaos, without the masks. She wanted something lasting. For the first time in her adult life, she thought about the future not as a place to escape to, but as something she could build from scratch, something cleaner, something real. It was a quiet Thursday evening when it happened. There was no crowd, no camera flashes, no dramatic build-up. Zach had invited her over for dinner at his place, a small, warm flat on the second floor of an old building in Anthony Village. Cindy had grown fond of that space. It smelled of pepper soup and old books, and his playlists always hummed softly in the background like a heartbeat. That night he had made jollof rice and grilled chicken, and the electricity had held just long enough for the two of them to eat under a working ceiling fan. After clearing the plates, they sat by the open window, letting the cool breeze roll in. He said very little at first, just watched her with a softness that made her feel like maybe she deserved this version of peace. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he pulled out a small box from his pocket and opened it. A silver ring rested inside, simple, no stones, no shine. His voice didn't shake. "Cindy," he said, "I don't want perfect. I want honest. And I want it with you." For a moment, Cindy didn't move. It was as if time had folded, pressing all her memories against the walls of that room. She wasn't crying. Not yet. But her chest tightened as 100 voices ran through her mind, voices that told her she wasn't enough, that she had ruined her chances, that no good man would stay if he ever found out. But Zach didn't know those voices. He only knew the version of her she had shown him, the one she had carefully curated and protected. And now he was offering her something she had never dared to imagine, a future, wrapped not in judgment, but trust. Her fingers trembled as she touched the ring. It wasn't about the metal. It was what it meant: acceptance, belonging, maybe even redemption. She nodded, barely able to speak, and when he slipped it onto her finger, it felt like she had finally stepped into a new skin, one where she could leave behind the girl who had drifted from night to night, one where she could be something more. The following days passed in a haze of congratulations and excitement. Family calls, church bookings, fabric choices, everything moved with speed. Cindy smiled through it all, genuinely happy, yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet fear began to stir. It wasn't loud. It didn't interrupt the joy. It simply lingered, like a shadow that slipped through the edges of light. She hadn't told Zach about her past, not fully. Not the men, not the chaos, not the nights that blurred into mornings. She told herself it didn't matter, that she had changed, that love meant letting things go. But in moments of stillness, when she was alone, removing her makeup at night, or staring at the ring on her finger while brushing her teeth, she wondered if truth had a way of waiting, if it could remain hidden forever. But each time doubt tried to rise, she reminded herself of Zach's words, "I don't want perfect. I want honest." And so she chose to believe that her new life could bury the old one, if only she tried hard enough not to look back. The living room buzzed with soft music and warm chatter as family and close friends gathered for what was meant to be a casual pre-wedding introduction. Plates clinked, small chops disappeared fast, and bursts of laughter broke the air every few minutes. Cindy wore a delicate cream-lace dress, her hair pulled back in a low bun, her fingers unconsciously brushing the engagement ring she now wore like a second skin. Zach stood beside her, attentive and calm as always, making sure everyone felt welcomed. It was the first time many people from both families were meeting, and though there were too many faces to keep track of, Cindy made an effort to smile and nod where appropriate. Then Zach cleared his throat and turned slightly toward her, a quiet pride in his eyes. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said. "My best man." She looked up, expecting someone new, someone she could politely greet and forget. But her breath caught before his name even left Zach's lips. Standing across the room, dressed in a navy blue native and holding a glass of Chapman, was a face she couldn't pretend not to know. Toby. Their eyes locked, and in that brief moment, time stuttered. The room didn't spin, nothing dramatic happened, but inside her, something sharp twisted. Toby. Of all people. Of all the men she could have left in her past, why him? He didn't smile. He didn't wave. Just held her gaze with a calm that sent chills down her spine. Zach, unaware of the history between them, continued speaking, mentioning how Toby had been his closest friend since university, how they'd seen each other through everything, how he couldn't imagine standing at the altar without him. Cindy's smile strained at the edges, her heartbeat now a steady thump in her throat. She forced her legs to move and approached Toby with an extended hand. "Good to see you again," she said, voice low. He held her hand a second too long. "Very good to see you again, Cindy," he replied, the hint of a smirk playing on his lips. She could see it in his eyes, recognition, memory, and worse, knowing. She excused herself soon after, retreating to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Her reflection stared back from the mirror, calm but cracked. The past she had buried hadn't just returned. It had been invited into the inner circle. That night, long after the guests had left and the laughter had faded into silence, Cindy lay awake in bed beside Zach. His breathing was steady, his back turned slightly toward her in sleep. But her mind wouldn't rest. She scrolled through old pictures on her phone, as if trying to erase any evidence that might still remain. Toby wasn't just a random mistake. He had been part of the messiest chapter of her life. A man who had seen her at her most reckless, who had shared secrets and sins that she never wanted Zach to imagine, let alone hear. She thought about confronting him, about begging for silence, but a deeper fear gnawed at her. What if she had no control over what Toby chose to reveal? What if he already had? The ring on her finger felt heavier now. The walls around her began to shift, no longer the sturdy walls of love and hope, but fragile ones, easily cracked by a single whisper. And in that dark, still room, Cindy began to feel the shape of dread take form. 3 days after the gathering, Cindy found herself sitting alone in her car, parked in front of a fabric store she had no intention of entering. Her phone buzzed with reminders, bridal fittings, guest list updates, calls from her aunt about catering decisions. But her thoughts refused to shift from Toby. Since the night he reappeared, her peace had begun to unravel at the seams. He hadn't contacted her. He hadn't said anything beyond that cryptic greeting. But silence, in this case, was louder than confrontation. The restraint in his voice, the look in his eyes, it was deliberate. Controlled. Toby didn't need to speak just yet. His mere presence was enough to keep her in a state of unease. She imagined different scenarios over and over. Toby casually mentioning something to Zach over drinks, or dropping hints during the wedding toast, or worse, revealing details she couldn't undo. She considered calling him, asking for a private meeting, but every time she opened her contact list, her finger froze. What would she say? What could she offer that would guarantee his silence? Her opportunity came unexpectedly. It was during a late afternoon fitting at the designer's studio on the island. The bridal party had been invited to test fabrics, and as luck, or fate, would have it, Toby walked in alone while Zach was stuck in traffic. Cindy stood at the far end of the room, watching him approach slowly, that same unreadable expression stretched across his face. "Beautiful choices," he said, eyes flicking briefly over the shimmering materials before settling on her. They stepped outside to speak, away from the seamstresses and assistants buzzing around the studio. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows over the compound wall. Cindy's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I didn't know you and Zach were close," she said, carefully measured. Toby didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, as though trying to decide how much weight to give his words. "We've seen each other through a lot," he finally said. "Which makes this delicate." Cindy swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Toby, whatever you think you know, whatever you remember, it's not who I am anymore." He nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "That may be true," he said. "But do you think Zach knows that?" His words weren't loud, but they struck like a hammer. Then he smiled, polite, practiced, and walked away before she could say anything more. That night, sleep refused to come. Cindy sat up in bed, her heart pacing against her ribs, her mind reaching for control. She needed a plan. She thought about telling Zach herself, maybe frame it gently, confess parts of the truth without giving away the worst of it. But the fear of his reaction kept her paralyzed. What if he looked at her differently? What if everything they had built came undone? The engagement, the promises, the family acceptance, it could all vanish with one story from the wrong lips. She tried praying, whispering words into the darkness, hoping that silence would mean mercy. But in her gut, she knew Toby wouldn't stay quiet forever. Not out of malice, he didn't even seem angry, but simply because he could. And power, she'd learned long ago, didn't always come with a threat. Sometimes it sat in the room silently, waiting for your world to crack on its own. The changes in Zach didn't come all at once. They arrived in fragments, like sunlight slipping behind slow-moving clouds. First, it was the missed calls. Then the long pauses in conversation, the way he began to look through her instead of at her. Cindy noticed it, though he never said a word. During the final wedding planning meeting with the decorator, Zach barely contributed, nodding to everything but hardly meeting her gaze. His smile, once spontaneous and full, now felt hesitant, thin at the edges. She brushed it off as stress. Men didn't often enjoy the chaos of wedding planning. But deep down, the knot in her stomach had started to twist tighter. Something had shifted. She began to notice how often Zach was on his phone, how he now left messages unanswered for hours, how he'd excuse himself in the evenings to take long walks that he didn't used to take. Cindy didn't ask questions, not because she didn't want answers, but because she feared the weight of the ones that might come. Meanwhile, whispers started to drift from places she hadn't expected. A friend from her university days called one afternoon, voice hesitant, almost apologetic. "Someone's been asking questions," she said, "about your past, the clubbing, the guys, the parties. Are you okay?" Cindy's hands had gone cold. She ended the call politely and sat in silence, trying to breathe through the panic. Later that week, she ran into an old acquaintance at a supermarket in Acadia. They exchanged awkward pleasantries, but the look the woman gave her said more than any words could, curiosity edged with quiet judgment. Cindy realized with slow horror that the shadows she thought had vanished were returning like stains under sunlight. At home, she began checking Zach's expressions more carefully, replaying their conversations to catch what wasn't being said. One night, while folding laundry, she asked him, gently, casually, if he was okay. He nodded, but his eyes didn't. The days leading up to the wedding moved with mechanical speed. Dresses arrived. Invitations were distributed. Her mother called more often, reminding her to remain prayerful, to smile, to stay grateful. But Cindy felt like she was moving inside a shell, her steps rehearsed, her reactions timed. At night, when Zach kissed her forehead and said goodnight, it no longer felt like affection. It felt like a goodbye trapped in a gesture. One evening, as they reviewed the guest lists, Zach paused at a name. He stared at it for a moment, then asked, "How well do you know Toby?" The air thinned. Cindy's heart clenched. She smiled too quickly, said something vague. Zach didn't respond. He simply marked the name and continued. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his tone, his pause. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the wind had changed, and the air now smelled like rain. 2 nights before the wedding, the world around Cindy felt eerily still. The house was quiet, her bridal gown hung by the window, untouched, wrapped in transparent plastic like a fragile secret. The scent of rose petals from the bridal shower still lingered faintly in the air. She had just stepped out of the bathroom when her phone vibrated on the nightstand. A single message lit up the screen. Zach's name, nothing more than 4 words. "We need to talk." Her breath caught, and she sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, towel wrapped around her, skin still damp. A strange kind of cold settled in her bones. For a long minute, she didn't move, didn't blink. Deep inside, she had known this would come. Not the wedding, not the happiness, but this moment, the reckoning. She called him immediately, hands trembling slightly, but his line was busy. She tried again. Voicemail. She dressed quickly, threw on a sweatshirt, and sat by the window, the phone in her lap like an unanswered question. He arrived just before midnight, his knock soft, but final. She opened the door and stepped aside silently, letting him in. Zach didn't sit. He didn't hug her. He stood by the table, both hands in his pockets, his jaw tense. "Toby told me," he said, without ceremony. His words were not angry, just steady, like someone recounting a story he had already heard many times in his head. Cindy's legs weakened beneath her, and she reached for the edge of the chair. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply asked, "Was there ever a time you thought I deserved to know?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came. There were too many things to say, yet none that would fix what had already shattered. She whispered an apology, tried to explain, told him how far she had come. Zach listened, his face unreadable, but his silence was its own kind of pain. "I'm not judging your past," he said quietly. "I'm hurting because you didn't trust me with it." That, more than anything, broke her, because it was true. When he left, he didn't promise to call. He didn't say he'd think about it. He simply closed the door behind him, and the emptiness that followed felt louder than anything she had ever known. The next morning, the news spread in trickles. Zach had called off the wedding. No details, no drama, just a decision. Her phone rang endlessly, friends asking what happened, family trying to salvage plans, whispers rising in corners where her name was now heavy. Cindy said nothing. She didn't cry immediately. She didn't scream. She just sat in the same place for hours, the dress still hanging by the window, its beauty now mocking. When she finally moved, it was to pull the curtain shut. Darkness settled over the room, quiet and thick. And for the first time in years, Cindy was alone, not just in space, but in truth. Everything she had run from had caught up. Not in rage, not in flames, but in the gentle, devastating quiet of a man who simply walked away. Cindy stopped opening her curtains. The sunlight became a stranger she no longer wished to welcome. Days passed in fragments, time no longer tied to purpose, but to survival. Calls from friends dwindled when she stopped responding, and eventually the phone settled into long stretches of silence. Her mother came by once, sitting on the edge of the bed, sighing between prayers, but left without pressing too hard. The dress was still there for a while, hanging like a ghost in the corner of the room, until one night Cindy rose quietly, took it down, and folded it into a box she sealed with tape and pushed far under the bed. Sleep came in uneasy stretches, and food became an afterthought. What remained was thought. Long, quiet stretches of it, thought about the version of herself she had built like armor, thought about all the choices she had made when she still believed consequences only came to other people. There was no comfort in the reflection, only recognition, raw, heavy, overdue. Weeks passed, and she began to leave the house again. Not for parties, not for any reinvention, just to walk. Just to remember what it felt like to be part of a world that didn't revolve around shame. The first time she stepped into her old salon, the receptionist blinked in surprise but said nothing. Cindy sat still as the stylist worked, the hum of the dryer almost comforting. On her way out, she passed a woman she used to call a friend, a girl from the old life, dressed in high heels and loud perfume. Their eyes met, and for a moment Cindy expected the smirk, the judgment, the sting. But instead, the woman nodded once, lips pressed in something almost like respect. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a bridge rebuilt. but it was something. That small moment carried her through the rest of the day. Later that week, she reached out to Tocci, a friend she hadn't spoken to in months, maybe a year, someone she had hurt and forgotten in the chaos of the life she once led. They met in a quiet cafe near Surulere. Cindy didn't offer excuses. She simply said, "I'm sorry." And for the first time in a long time, she felt herself exhale. Healing didn't come like a movie montage. It came in pauses, in the way she learned to clean her apartment again, slowly and deliberately, in the way she made her own food, even if it was just noodles and eggs. She bought a new journal, not to perform healing, but to make space for it. On some pages, she wrote her past plainly, without shame. On others, she left blank space, not knowing what would come next. She began volunteering twice a week at a women's center, helping organize outreach programs. No one there knew her story, and for once, she didn't feel the need to explain or defend herself. One evening, as she walked home through the quiet streets of Alupaju, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Not Zach. Just someone from the center thanking her for showing up. She paused on the sidewalk, stared at the screen, then smiled faintly. It wasn't joy. It wasn't closure. But it was movement. And that, finally, was enough. Rain fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm that afternoon, soft enough to walk through, but steady enough to soak the edges of memory. Cindy was coming back from the women's center, a stack of leaflets pressed under her arm, when she decided to take the longer route home. Something about the day felt open, like it was waiting for something to happen. The street was mostly empty, save for the occasional bike rider weaving between puddles and a young girl holding her mother's hand under a shared umbrella. Cindy moved with no real purpose, her slippers slapping against the wet pavement until she saw him. Zach, standing just ahead, near a bookstand tucked beside a narrow kiosk, flipping through a worn paperback like he had all the time in the world. For a moment, she froze. Her first instinct was to turn around, disappear, avoid the ache. But instead, she kept walking, each step measured, not towards him, but not away either. When he finally looked up, their eyes met. No tension, no dramatic silence. Just two people standing at the intersection of what was and what could never be again. Zach didn't smile, but he didn't look away. He nodded once, acknowledging her presence with the quiet dignity he had always carried. She returned the gesture, and for a moment they stood there, two versions of a story that had almost been. Cindy didn't stop to talk. She didn't reach for words that wouldn't fix anything. She simply passed by him, her pace steady, her chest surprisingly calm. There was no anger in her, no longing. Only a strange, soft acceptance, like the closing of a chapter without the need for a final sentence. As she turned the corner, she felt the rain beginning to soak through the back of her shirt, but she didn't rush. There was a stillness in her that hadn't been there before, the kind that comes not from forgetting, but from facing everything and surviving it anyway. Behind her, the past stood quiet, no longer chasing, no longer shouting, just watching her walk on. Later that night, she lit a small candle by her bedside, not for prayer, not for ritual, but just for light. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the journal open in front of her. She wrote slowly, her pen trailing carefully over each word. Not everything was behind her. Not yet. But for the first time, the future didn't feel like something she needed to earn. It felt like something she could shape, with truth, with patience, and with whatever version of love came next, even if that love was her own. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the occasional drip from the roof and the hum of distant traffic. Cindy closed the book, blew out the candle, and lay back on the floor, her hand resting gently over her chest. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was full with all the pain, all the choices, all the growth. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, she knew she would be okay. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.